Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Battlefields Bourbon podcast, the podcast where we talk bourbon whiskey and American Civil War history. Once again, I'm joined by my co-host Jack, and we've got a special guest here tonight, Mr. Mike Robinson. Tonight, we're actually not doing a bourbon, we're doing a rye whiskey, and we'll get a little bit into that as the episode goes on as to why. But tonight, we've got Catoctin Creek Ragnarök Rye. It's a limited edition rye whiskey from Catoctin Creek over in Purcellville, Virginia. So this rye is 100% rye in terms of the mash bill. So there's no other grains used in the making of this whiskey. And it is finished in sugar maple, cherry wood, and rum barrels. So it's got 3 different finishes on it. So it's got quite the flavor profile, which we'll see here in a few minutes. But the reason why we're doing rye, our battle tonight is the First Battle of Kernstown, and there's a one and only distillery from Winchester back during the Civil War, the Savage and Sons Distillery. And since that distillery is no longer in business, there's no better distillery to do than Catoctin Creek, an award-winning local rye distillery here in Virginia. So without further ado, we will pour a glass and see what we think.
Nice pop.
Oh, that was a good one. That was beautiful.
That's right.
Alrighty, I'll pass that over to you.
This is fancy.
Yeah, take what you want.
Yeah, we are, like Elijah said, we are joined by our second co-host guest of
Thank you.
of our podcast so far, Mr. Mike Robinson. Mike is we've been talking and friends for a couple years now, I think, ever since you kind of got started with your Winchester Tales and your just whole Tales expedition. You're a history guru, fanatic, metal detecting enthusiast, super passionate, and writes great pieces, books. How many are you at now?
9.
Yeah, 9, a part of the Tales series. Ranges from the Winchester Tales to just those plus Civil War Tales in Winchester, and then you have the Ghost, or no, has that not been published?
That's not out yet.
Okay.
I'm going to do Ghost, and then I think I'll do Colonial Tales as well at
man.
some point.
Yeah.
At some point.
Spoiler.
And it's the, you started it at a perfect time, probably purposefully, I think, right when COVID hit, or was it right before COVID?
No, it was like a COVID project.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The Winchester Tales page on Facebook.
Yeah.
Which, how many likes now?
21,000 followers.
Yeah, and so check that out. Winchester Tales is the main page, and then from there you'll just find all the other pages you've created from it.
That's right.
And it was a huge, success in getting people to connect with their roots and their local history again. And it was just so cool as a history lover myself to see people I'd never thought of liking history or being interested in it, sharing your post, commenting your post, and just creating a sense of community with history, and specifically with the Winchester area. So, but other than that, we wanted to have you on because of your connection to Kernstown, and that's our battle today, is the First Battle of Kernstown, because it's where you grew up. You grew up basically on the battlefield, and as a kid, hiked and climbed and got dirty all over these fields on the south side of Winchester. But that's you, and we thank you so much for coming on. And as you told us going into this, you are not a big bourbon guy or a whiskey guy.
No, I never drank whiskey for taste, texture, and fragrance.
Yeah.
I drank it to get loaded as fast as I possibly could. So it's a change. It's a nice change.
Yeah.
I've matured in this drink, but so I appreciate you guys.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, Winchester Tales was something that kind of just came to me because I knew people loved a good story. And the timeline of our area is so vast. Mm-hmm. And I always say this, that we're so lucky we're different from any other city. And I'm even saying Boston and Philadelphia and established cities like that their timelines aren't as vast and long as ours. we start all the way at the Thunderbird site below Front Royal. That's Paleo-Indian at 12,000 years. The buffalo herds that came through the Shenandoah Valley created the paths that would become the Great Warrior Path and the Great Wagon Road and Route 11. That is all stems from those buffalo herds of the 12,000 years ago. So my point was, I saw each of these stories that I was finding in the depths of these books that I was diving into, and I knew they were good. And how I saw them was they were like mini movies, 1.5-minute movies. And if I wrote them like that with a beginning, middle, and end, as a fly on the wall of these situations and these people, that it would resonate. It would find people, and it did.
Yeah.
And that's all. I've told other art. I give credit where credit's due. Like I talked to Jonathan Noalis, and I say, I don't do what you do.
Yeah.
I'm the stepping stone of getting people interested in something that they can find the full story in your books. So if I can get them interested through social media, because I think that's what really was missing. We have a great historical society. You guys do a great job with the Battlefields, but there's got to be a way to pull the younger generation in, and through social media was kind of the way I was going to do it, and it took off fast. But yeah, going back to what you were saying, yeah, Kernstown was something I saw every day. I grew up in Stonebrook, and then we moved to Brookneal, which were side by side subdivisions. So as a kid of the mid 70s, I was finding all kinds of stuff in the creeks and all around Stonebrook, up on Sandy Ridge in Kernstown, just running those woods as kids, a gang of kids. We'd just be running around. So that's really kind of what it started with Kernstown. But the funny thing is, I would find all that stuff, and I didn't know about the battle. I didn't know where the strategic points of the battle were. So by doing, just getting back into history after I left Los Angeles and came back to Winchester, I went back to Shepherd and got my degree. And I did a lot of research at the Tyler Moore Civil War Center up there. Is it George Tyler Moore? I can't remember.
I think so.
Yeah. So, so then I started digging into Kernstown deeper. And then just with you guys and the great people at the Kernstown Battlefield, it's just become my passion now. It's my favorite battle, because I believe, excuse me, it's Stonewall Jackson at his worst. To me, it is. Just for the fact that he's coming off of that Romney campaign after trying to court-martial Loring and Gilmer. Right? He's not the Stonewall Jackson of Henry House Hill. He's a man, I think, who hasn't found himself completely yet. He comes to Winchester with like 10,000. By the time Kernstown happens, he's reduced to 3,400, I think, of troops that could take the field. At odds with Loring's old brigade. They always looked at the Stonewall Brigade as they kind of had a rivalry going, as Stonewall looked at them as his favorite, the 1st Virginia. But I think Stonewall in Winchester at that time was a Stonewall that hadn't really truly found his comfort zone, his place. He
had the name, but he didn't have the identity maybe yet, like in your point of view. Yeah.
And people didn't know him yet as a field commander. He wasn't a Robert E. Lee where wrote out his field tactics, and everybody knew their job. Stonewall was more on the fly. So what makes Kernstown so important to that first beginning story of Stonewall is it's a battle of miscommunication completely, and angst and retribution, because he held grudges, as you can tell with Loring and Gilmer, but also with Garnett at later, after the Battle of Kernstown, he held grudges. Yeah. But that's what I like to do, is to study the man who was Stonewall Jackson and what he may have been done differently. Yeah. Hindsight is always 20/20 in military, especially military tactics. But by leaving his, he left a wagon train full of ammunition in Kernstown, or in Stevens City, that he should have brought up to the battlefield, but he didn't. He didn't do it. He never told Garnett himself about his, when he sent Fulkerson in up against Pritchard's Hill. He never told him why. And he was why he was supporting him. He sent a subordinate to tell Garnett. So it's kind of interesting to the person of Stonewall Jackson, because we've made him into such a magnanimous, being.
History views him in a better light after the fact.
Well, yeah, and you don't question his tactics, but this is a flawed general at this time, and he learns from those mistakes and becomes a better field tactician, and I think he's a better communicator as he gets later in the war.
Yeah,
so
and
it's interesting.
We'll dive into it, but first the moment Mike's been dreading, I'm sure, up to this point, or you're going to shoot her down. But let's taste this rye whiskey.
It smells very good, actually.
It smells more like rum to me than whiskey, just based off the rum finish. But
Good.
That's a good one. Yeah, 92 proof.
That will make your bull run, right? Had to make a Civil War joke.
And they don't state how long this is aged for, so I'm not entirely sure the age statement on this, but it's aged in quarter casks, so they're the smaller barrels, so that interaction with the oak and stuff kind of happens a little more rapidly than it would in the larger barrel.
Well, that's how you get the color, right?
Yeah, that's where the color comes from. But being in quarter casks and stuff like that, I don't think they age it for as long as you normally would in like your standard like 53-gallon barrel. But even still, even though we're doing rye instead of bourbon, it follows the same guidelines. Rye whiskey has to be at least 51% rye.
And it's 100% rye.
This one's 100%, so you just knock out all doubt there. Same guidelines as bourbon in that regard, 51% of the main grain to make it what it is, either bourbon or rye. Aged in oak barrels, all that stuff. Plus, it's cool to talk about rye because that's like the whiskey of choice during the Civil War and the early days of, American history before bourbon really took off.
That's interesting.
Later on.
Well, it kind of goes in, during that, going back to talking about Jackson, so Winchester loved him. So when that happened, when the Union Army started collecting at Harper's Ferry, and you're talking, Nathaniel Banks and Shields and who else was with
Kimball,
Sedgwick, and Williams. Those four that came through Harper's Ferry. And when Stonewall had to leave out of town, pretty much the first engagement after Jackson got down to Strasburg and Shields came into town, they had a little engagement north of Hog Creek in Kernstown, right around where that bank is, right around where the old Rubbermaid is. And that's where that Ashby and Naden Bush, the Confederates, were. They hit the first lines of Shields' guys right around where Savage would have had his distillery. I'm sitting there looking at this crock. It's amazing condition. But he was making rye. Is that,
Mm-hmm.
And it kind of makes you wonder. We saw the picture of him, and I don't know if we'll be
we'll post all
it.
that.
Yeah, I mean, he just looks like a guy who knew his whiskey. I can tell you that. With his long pipe. But it's amazing that first action of Kernstown happened on Savage's property, and he would turn this around after the war and become,
and create the distillery, and
and it was a big deal. I mean, he was big enough to have a distillery that. The old pictures show that was had a smokestack, and I mean it was a big operation, and he had a storefront on Loudon Street in the 1870s, and this is where this crock would have come from, and we were just talking about it. You would probably get this filled and then refilled as you came in, cork it and take it home with you, but it would have been that. Do you think it was 100 proof? Probably then, I'm sure.
I think some of the stuff back in the day was like straight out of the barrel proof. Mm-hmm. So normally barrel proof stuff is in the 125, 130 proof. It's hot. Yeah, it's stuff that's like straight off the still, straight into the barrel. I don't think they dabbled in proofing stuff down too much back in the earlier days.
Yeah.
I think that's more of a modern innovation in terms of whiskey.
No wonder Savage looked like he did.
It'll put some hair on your chest.
Yeah,
for sure.
put that hair on his face.
Oh,
and
man,
yeah, I think it's cool. You guys will see the picture of it when we post the picture of the crock. But it says pure Kernstown rye, which I think is just so cool because it's like that meant something back then.
Yeah. And right across the street from there would have been the only standing structure in Kernstown that's still there.
Still there, yeah.
Yeah, and it's the tavern. It has the columns, and the name escapes me. Beamer. It was the Beamer Tavern. So right across from that little bank on the corner was the original. It would have been there when Savage had his house on that corner and his distillery, which is kind of cool.
And it's cool to think that Hog Run could have, provided water for the distillery.
Oh, no doubt.
Obviously. And it's the same creek where, I'm sure men will seek safety during the battles that, not just this one, First Kernstown, but Second Kernstown and Second Winchester, and all these other battles that form and skirmishes that happen there. So, and to kind of just set up the battle before we get into it, it's just set up the geography of the area. Kernstown itself, when you look at a map and you read about it, was a small village about 5 miles south of the heart of Winchester, which was the town that, the old town area we know today. So it's about 5 miles south. If you drive the Valley Pike today or Route 11, you wouldn't notice a difference. There's not a break, but back during the war, it was farm fields for those 5 miles until you hit the town of Winchester. All today, it's car dealerships and things like that, and there's not a break in the terrain. But it was a separate village. I think today the city limits bump up to Hog Creek, but like you said, it's neat to know that there's just one surviving structure of that original village that's there, encompassed around a bunch of modern development. But there's a huge, and we'll talk about this at the end, the amount of preservation that's taken place there. But the Kernstown battlefield itself is pretty large, and despite the disadvantages with development and roads being built and all those things that separate and destroy battlefields, there's 2 pretty large portions of the battlefield that have been preserved and you can access today. But leading up to this, like you said, Jackson was north. He was on the banks of the Potomac River. He was west all the way to Romney and Bath, or modern day Berkeley Springs, and he was back in Winchester, and then he was the Federals were coming, and he heads south all the way to Mount Jackson, and now he's heading back north. And Ashby's men, where do you say, close to where Savage's house was along the east side of the Valley Pike next to Hog Run, is where Ashby's men will come up and kind of begin the initial phases of the First Battle of Kernstown. So we're looking at March 23rd of 1862 for this battle, and it's a cold day.
Yeah, and they pulled out a day. It's kind of amazing that Stonewall got out on, I think, March 12th.
Yeah.
And on March 11th, he pulled his officers in at Alta Vista, up on Braddock Street, and formulated a nighttime attack plan. He wanted to attack the camps where they were outside of Stevenson's Depot, is where he wanted to attack the Union Army at night. All of his subordinates voted against it, especially Garnett. And I think that's where because he told Sandy Pendleton later on, he said, that's the last war council I'll ever hold.
Yeah.
And it was. And I think he held that grudge with Garnett at that moment. I think he had it anyway, but I think that really set him off. So on the 12th, they make the move. They start off and they stop in Newtown. Shields, they press. They come into Winchester and they press. And they get them, I think, all the way down. I think they started getting some resistance, I think, below Stevens City, Newtown. But they push back up. Stonewall tells Turner Ashby to press back up into Winchester. And I think they get all the way up past the Burger King on Cedar Creek Grade in Valley. Right about there, that's where Turner Ashby was kind of set right there. They were Choose Battery was in support of Turner Ashby and was lobbing shells probably around where Ward's Plaza is. And one of those shells fragments hits Shields in the arm and breaks his arm right that midsection of Valley right there where the Ford dealership was, and right around Hollingsworth Mill.
Yeah.
So that kind of sets it off. But the thing is, what's so funny, and this is where it starts of the communication breakdown. Turner Ashby reports that they only have 3,000, Gets back to Jackson. Jackson says, "Well, 3,000. Okay, I can handle that." Not knowing that they've got reserve 3,500 in reserve north of town. So this kind of starts off badly. So Jackson makes the move to start coming north. I think to go back. I think I think Shields pressed them all the way to Strasburg, almost, maybe a little past Strasburg, because I remember they got pushed back by Ashby originally, so they got pulled back to Strasburg and then went back to Winchester. But that's kind of how it all started. And the thing is, this battle really didn't get really cooking until about noon or 1 o'clock because of that Ashby, Nadenbush, and the Union.
And that
line.
happens with Ashby pushing up to like the area of, I guess that would be considered Milltown.
Yeah.
Like just a little bit north there on Valley.
You got Parkins Mill and Hollingsworth Mill were right there.
Yeah,
in Milltown.
And this is a couple days before the battle that we know. So this is Ashby testing, like you said, the breakdown of communication. Ashby,
Well, it's so much of a miscommunication because once Shields gets wounded, he goes back to the Seaver House over on Boscawen, and Shields all the way up through the day is still thinking he's taking on 700 of Turner Ashby's men.
Yeah,
he doesn't really understand the gravity yet of the situation. At the same time, Stonewall's making his 24-mile march up the Valley Road, and kind of sets up right around south of the Opequon Church. I would say where the old General Electric plant is, which is now the Rubbermaid warehouse there on Apple Valley Road as it meets. So right around in that area. So at the same time, Shields puts Nathan Kimball in charge. So what does Kimball do? And what does Turner Ashby do? He misses the greatest opportunity to take the high position at Pritchard's Hill because he pulls back to right around where Camp Russell is.
That's just north of Newtown.
Yeah, he pulled back right around there. And it gives Kimball the opportunity to set up those guns up on Pritchard's Hill.
Yeah, and I guess let's set that up more with the geography. Is with Kernstown where it's at. The Valley Pike is obviously the thing that connects Winchester to Kernstown and many other towns throughout the valley. On Hog Creek, this creek we were talking about, cuts across, runs. The Valley Pike runs north to south. Let's say Hog Creek runs west to east. Towards, and it flows into the Opequon, I believe.
Yeah, and what's amazing about that area, I mean, the Opequon Presbyterian Church that's there now. Prior to that, there was an earlier church structure, but that goes all the way back to Yost Height and to William Hogg, or Hogue. They think they've it was a mispronunciation over the years that it became Hogg. Because they thought that the hogs were maybe feeding around there or something like that. But William Hogue settled that land right there. So if you're up on that hill, the big promontory on that property is what they would call the Pritchard's Hill, because the Pritchard family built that brick house that's there now. But if you're up there, you can look all the way across in the horizon. You can see Ashby Gap. You can see Castleman Gap of Route 7. You can see all the way to Strasburg at Massanutten Mountain. You can see the gaps of Luray. I mean, you can see, all over.
Yeah.
You've got an incredible panoramic view. But off to if you're facing out and facing south, it's open fields.
Yeah.
Okay? And then off to your right, off in the distance, would be a kind of, I call it a spine that runs, which would be called Sandy Ridge.
And these run roughly north and south.
That's right.
Pritchard's Hill is on the west side of the Valley Pike, or Route 11, running north to south. And it ends right at Hog Run as it's coming across the Valley Pike there.
Yeah.
But it runs parallel with the Valley Pike, and like Mike said, has this great vista and commands any approach for miles.
Yeah.
And like you said, Ashby missed an opportunity to take it, but Kimball is going to take the...
And Ashby didn't have that 4... I think Stonewall gave him 4 regiments to support him in that I call it the second kind of phase. So at that point, I don't think he had that support, infantry support at that time to think about taking that hill. So by the time that they're all lined back up, and they're kind of hanging south of Peck and Church, and Stonewall is kind of assessing that situation. And I still don't understand, with such a tactician, why he would send Fulkerson on a direct assault on a position like Pritchard's Hill, with artillery that could just rain down on you.
Right.
They were in perfect distance, everything. Shooting canister and solid shot down on those guys. It didn't take long for them. It took about 80 casualties in that field, and that's where Stonewall. It's really cool what Kernstown Battlefield. Those guys have done some really cool things. There's an area called Barton's Woods, which is off of Shady Elm Lane. Yeah, Shady Elm. That turns into Apple Valley, but they put a little stand there where they think that Stonewall was to start directing traffic, more or less. So at that point is where that assistant came, or Stonewall wouldn't. Two things Stonewall didn't do at that juncture. He didn't meet with Turner Ashby directly to say, what's the situation? What's going on here? Secondly, he didn't meet with Garnett and say, I'm sending Fulkerson in frontal attack. I want to, the whole point of that frontal attack, and I don't know why they went that way. They could have gone down Apple Valley and went back up Middle Road if they wanted to attack the left flank of Pritchard's Hill, which is what they were trying to do. They were trying to turn. I want you to turn that battery, is what Stonewall said. Turning that battery in military terms is, I want you to take that, flank that battery. Mm-hmm. So when Fulkerson and his men went through that field, they just got decimated. And then you start seeing the battle map, and when you look at these battle maps, you start seeing that arrow start going off to the west when they start
taking a wide.
Yeah, and that's when Stonewall sent those three batteries up to Sandy Ridge, and he said that's where the artillery duel was going to start. And he had 5 artillery units, but it was the McLaughlin, Waters, and Carpenter's batteries that would set 1, 2, 3 up on Sandy Ridge. That's when the artillery barrage was happening. In the Union, they had put their infantry at the base of Pritchard's Hill, waiting for that frontal if Fulkerson got through. So those guns up on Sandy Ridge, once they started firing, they were just reaching that base. So they're getting into the Union lines at the base of Pritchard's Hill. But at that time, Garnett was confused. He had sent only half of his men to support Fulkerson. The other half were on their way up to Sandy Ridge. Stonewall had already taken Garnett's batteries and started deploying them himself. So he wasn't even telling Garnett what he was doing up there.
Yeah.
So there was real lack of communication at the onset of that battle. So when the Confederate infantry started making their way up to Sandy Ridge, that's when he sent units up that would eventually get to that stone wall on the glass farm at Rose Hill. Their whole point was to get back and take out the Robinson Union battery that had been placed over
on Pritchard's Hill.
Well, they placed them over Middle Road, on the other side of Middle Road.
Oh, yeah.
There's a church there now, but they set them over there. So the whole point of Jackson, he could see that battery from Sandy Ridge, and he was sending them around to go up Cedar Creek Grade and catch them from behind. But in doing so, at the same time, Kimball had called up Tyler's men. They came down from Stevenson's Depot. They're the ones who rolled into town playing John Brown's Body, and Mrs. Lee up here was all up in arms about it. Huh. But they came and they held up right around where Burger King is on Valley Avenue. And they stayed there until Kimball called them into action. He said, head up Cedar Creek Grade until you get into the woods, which is the woods on the other side of 37 Overpass, and head west. South. Yeah, south. So the Confederates, and they're coming at the same time. Which is so ironic is that they're both going after batteries. Yeah. They're both that's what they were trying to do, because Carpenter's battery was on the furthest
on Sandy Ridge.
That's right. So they were trying to go after Carpenter's battery, and so the Confederates made it to that wall that behind Rose Hill first.
Yeah. What stood between them was that wall It's just, what are the odds of that? They're both same objectives on each side.
Timing.
And then there's a wall.
Well, and it comes down to, you and I both have discussed this in the past, is that when the military with that many men are marching through woods, it's easier to have a tight, compact group. Mm-hmm. So you're not so flared out. You might be 30 to 50 men wide, but quarter of a mile deep. Mm-hmm. So coming through those woods like that, and coming out on that other side of the woods to a stone wall, which was on a rise, with only 320 Confederates behind it at that time, but they were being decimated. Those Ohio, Pennsylvania, and West Virginia guys that were coming out of those woods were just being eaten up quickly until Tyler could figure it out and start flaring them out more. But they'd spend 2 to 3 hours at that wall.
Yeah, we'll try to put the map up, the Hotchkiss map of the battle. But this stone wall runs west to east as well, and into the side and up of Sandy Ridge, which is running north to south.
Yeah, and it didn't get cut away by 37. The wall stopped before 37 even then. But there's a series of walls on that glass property. There's the main wall that they fought over, and then there's one that's the next wall that's
south
of it, and then there's another wall
that these Confederates would go back to.
Yeah, so in the later phases of the war, those walls would
and this wall is on the western side of Sandy Ridge, running west to east. So you have the protection to your flank with your artillery up on Sandy Ridge, firing to the east to Pritchard's Hill, where there's what is it, 16 guns of Federal guns on Pritchard's Hill before they move Robinson's to the other side of the middle road.
And what they did the Confederates did with Carpenter's was the furthest. Which direction would that be?
Would it be like north or south?
Yeah, north. They turned that Carpenter's battery around and started firing into Tyler's
guys
left flank.
Yeah,
and doing a lot of damage. But that's where Garnett, Jackson Woods Estates, that subdivision. I always wondered. I thought when I was a kid, I used to think that that's where Jackson was making all of his decisions.
Which you would think based off the name,
right? But Jackson was moving around. He was very hands-on back in those woods. But that's actually where the first group of Confederates met after coming off of the base of Pritchard's Hill. Mm-hmm. And that's when they were started getting delegated and told where to go. And that's where there's an area up there called Garnett's Field. And that's kind of where Garnett was starting to, he would fill the 33rd in on that wall, the 37th. And, they just started filling holes.
On the wall, yeah.
That's right. And what's so funny is that how fast Fulkerson got back up on that ridge from being in a position where he was being destroyed in that open field at the base of Pritchard's Hill. By the time, we discussed this too, when Thoburn, the Union colonel,
colonel,
when he came out of those woods, he had taken the West Virginians to the right flank of the wall. And there's a perpendicular wall that comes off of that main wall. It's been rebuilt. It's pretty cool up there. There's only a few remaining sections of that original wall as you go up the hill. The section that you see now has been rebuilt. Mm-hmm. It's still cool. The center was more to the right, up the hill a little more. But there is a perpendicular wall that comes off of that wall. And Thoburn came on the right of that wall and tried to flank that wall. Fulkerson made it just in time
to be there
with about 500 men, and repulsed the attack. And they shot Thoburn. He got taken off the field. He got shot in the arm. But they had to jump on the other. Actually, they were on the left of the perpendicular wall. Was taking so much heat that they had to jump onto the right of that wall for cover. And then Fulkerson was able to drive them back.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to note, too, at the beginning with Fulkerson's advance, the only way you can kind of get this perspective is by going to Pritchard's Hill and standing where all those Federal guns were on Pritchard's Hill.
Yeah.
And then just you can still see the same woodlot that Fulkerson hugged the right of, or the eastern side of, and then took a sharp left turn in the direction of Sandy Ridge. And you're like, it's like what you said earlier. It's like, why not use the road the other three, the 4th, 2nd, and 27th Virginia regiments used to go to Sandy Ridge? But instead they walk along a woodlot, and then in front of the woodlot, an open view of those 16 guns and all Federal regiments.
Yeah. And when you're up on Pritchard's Hill, I was just up there a couple of days ago. When you look down, you'll see a barn with a silo, and there's a couple interpretive markers to the right of that silo. That's the position. Well, you can look off to the left of the barn and see the open field, and you just see how flat and open and easy it would have been to rain artillery down on that position. Where that silo is where Fulkerson broke off and headed to Sandy Ridge. But it was just a very weird opening to the battle, because I think they didn't really know how the infantry was going to play or fall into this battle until that rush to that wall, and that's really where it all took place.
Yeah, the battle. I mean, you'd think based off of the opening scenes, and before we even got to the Stonewall, you'd think, okay, and kind of what people would know from the battle and what's been preserved and things like that. You'd go, okay, the battle was at the Pritchard's farm, and it was at Pritchard's Hill, and they assaulted Pritchard's Hill, and it's like, no, it was obvious from the beginning that that's not what you're assaulting, but just the complete chaos of getting to where you need to be, which is the ridge to the battle's really for Sandy Ridge, like once the Stonewall comes into play.
It's different. It's completely different from Second Kernstown, where everything kind of takes place right around the Pritchard's house and the Stonewall that fronts that road. This was a Stonewall Jackson being a artillery tactician, and I think it comes back from his days in the Mexican War and also from VMI. He saw that he saw the Sandy Ridge position and knew that's where he had to put those guns, and he was hell bent on getting those up there, and they got him up there pretty quickly, and it just turned into an artillery battle. They said within the 3 hours or 4 hours of that artillery, it was 700 rounds that flew over those fields back and forth. So I mean, it was a massive display, but it just was too. The line up there at the wall was too thin. Then you throw into the elements of miscommunication. So you have Fulkerson and Garnett's men up there not taking orders from one or the other. Nobody was really in command. Garnett couldn't tell those men what to do, and vice versa. So the chain of command was breaking down up there. They didn't, that was what Lee was so good at. Lee was able to ascertain what was weak and fill that gap. They just didn't have that. They had some good guys up there. Name escapes me but it was a battle that was being run by lower officers, and they did. It was a fantastic job at that wall. And I always think about if they would have brought those ammunition stores up from Newtown and had them at their disposal, they would have made it to nighttime. By the time the battle, it was dusk. The sun was setting. 6 o'clock. It was almost 6:30.
And it was Garnett, was it not, that gave the call to the Virginians to fall back from that wall. So they surrendered that position when they could have technically held it, but at what cost?
Well, there were men who ran out of ammunition that were already running back. And Stonewall actually had stopped one and said, "Hey, where are you going?" And he said, "I'm out of ammunition." And he said, "Well, go back and give him the bayonet." And,
as Jackson does.
Typical, right? But at that point, people were leaving that wall, and it was actually Garnett who he saw the only reserve unit that wasn't engaged, was getting ready to get into the fight, and he said, and Garnett stopped him and said, "All you can be is protect the rear for the retreat." And that's where those two other stone walls come into play, and that was the one that would border the Deering first wall. Mm-hmm. That was the first wall. The second one was at the Davmar subdivision off of Jones Road.
Still there too, correct?
Still there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Original wall.
And that's what gets me about growing up. I grew up several years in Stonebrook. Then I finished out my high school years in Brookneal. And when you get into Brookneal, you cross. Have you been in Brookneal subdivision? I
believe so.
Down in the middle is you go down and you cross over. It's kind of a spring. And, it's back in the early 1900s. It was like a resort. They had made a big lake out of it. But during the Civil War, it was called Neal's Dam, and they called the woods around it. They called it the Big Woods. And you got to remember, there's a couple like Barton was fighting in that battle. So these guys were locals.
Yeah,
they had probably
Bell. I mean, Robert Sherrard Bell was in the Rockbridge Artillery. He gets captured at this battle. He was there.
Well, a lot of those guys were captured there because what they had decided. Well, the Union cavalry had ridden around right in between Funston. Do you remember Funston? He was a colonel. He was with Ashby. Ashby had divided his men in half. And if you're standing in front of Rose Hill, the house, and you look off towards Stonebrook, and there's a big hill right there, and Funston was on that hill with 200 cavalry up there,
extending what would virtually be like, if you looked at it on a map, the left flank of
That's
the
right.
Confederates.
Yeah, and it was probably supposed to maybe protect that flank at some point. They never really were that engaged, but the Union cavalry slipped in between Funston and the wall, and got in along pretty much along Jones Road, and rode back to Neal's Dam and started collecting prisoners. And there's a guy Langhorne. I just wrote a story about Langhorne. He was a lieutenant, and he got into those woods, and he was actually mounted, and he got off his mount and slapped his horse on the rear and started running through the woods because the men felt that it was harder for the U.S. cavalry to get into the woods and capture, so they thought they could go through those woods, through what Brookneal subdivision is, and pop out on the other side on Middle Road. Mm-hmm. There's a road up there called Firelock Court off of Middle Road. Right. It would have taken you right down to where Jackson was retreating, which was back across Shady Elm and back to Springdale, and then down Route 11. But Langhorne got caught in there. He got surrounded. He started firing his pistol. They shot him in the side. He threw his pistol down because it jammed. He pulled his sword out, started swinging his sword all around at everybody. Then I think they shot him again. He threw his sword at the guy and then pulled his pistol out to load his second pistol, and they shot him like 2 more times. And then he finally took his ring off and said, "Give this ring to my mother and let her know that I would rather die than surrender." But that happened right there at the Brookneal Bridge. Wow. And I passed it every day of my life and never knew it.
And no one thinks often that the battle would extend that, which is not that far from the main Confederate line, but still it's like...
It's a good mile from the main battle lines. I mean, that's a skedaddle. They were moving. They were trying to get out of there. And you had that last faction that was at that last stone wall, that Davmar subdivision stone wall, that was holding off that last onslaught to give them that 20 minutes. They said they gave them about 20 minutes to get those men down Middle Road and out that farm. There's the stone house is still there, where there's an old lane that used to go all the way across Shady Elm and down to Valley Avenue or to Route 11, and the lane is still there. You can still see it. You can drive back there and look at it.
So as the Confederates are kind of Stonewall hopping here, or at this point, and Tyler's guys are putting pressures on the Stonewall, and the Confederate communication is just falling apart. What's happening with the rest of the infantry that's kind of on Pritchard's in that open ground between Pritchard's?
The far right flank, at the top of the hill had to hinge back. And I think it was the second. Is it Second Virginia?
Second Virginia, and then there's the 21st Virginia Battalion up there.
They more or less started getting heat from the infantry that Kimball was sending off of Pritchard's Hill. So Carpenter's battery is up there, and they got turned. And had to start pulling back. Then you had Waters' battery, and that's an interesting thing because there's a Colonel Murray from the 14th Pennsylvania that came up. Do you see the 14th Pennsylvania coming up the hill?
Yeah.
Yeah. Colonel Murray was coming up, and it's
Indiana, you mean? There's
no,
a 14th.
There's
84th
well, there's an
Pennsylvania?
84th, and there should be a 14th. I
Okay.
think. But sad story about him is that he was his NCOs put together a petition, and I think they had a good many signatures on there asking him to resign, that he was not a good officer, and they wanted him to resign. So, and it's funny how when you get slighted in the Civil War, how you overcompensate in the next battle to try to regain that honor. Mm-hmm. You know, Garnett would do that at Gettysburg and die on the field and was buried on the field somewhere. The same with Colonel Murray. He comes up and they try to take the Waters battery, the middle battery, and they say that he got shot to where his hat insignia was driven into his brain. Like
wow.
Yeah, I mean, it was like that. It was that bad. It freaked out those guys. I mean, it was something pretty bad. But the guy who gave him the most praise from after the battle was the guy who was the first signature on his request for resignation. But they wanted to put a monument up there for him. Because they were able to take that battery. Well, they pushed the battery back. Mm-hmm. Stonewall lost one piece of artillery up there because I think the wheel the caisson or something got blown, or the wheel got blown off or something of that nature. But they said if they would have had, the Confederates would have had more rigid command up on that wall, they could have taken that 500-man Fulkerson. It was probably reduced down to 400 maybe by that time, but they could have taken that far left flank, pushed it back up onto the ridge to line up along that ridge line to protect against their artillery against that infantry, because there's no way to stop it.
Yeah, because that's like the second, you get the one punch to the face from Tyler at the Stonewall, and that's like a couple hour long punch, and then you've got the the left hook coming in from those regiments coming from Pritchard's Hill to Sandy Ridge. Yeah. That's just those poor guys on the curve of the line at the Stonewall just have to see that coming and take it, and your artillery's turning and just complete chaos.
And Gary, is it Gary Eckelbarger?
Yeah, Eckelbarger.
Eckelbarger, great book. We are in for it.
Yeah, that is our book recommendation for this episode. Yeah.
It's an incredible book and so well written. But he says it was kind of the perfect situation for the Union up on that hill. Not purpose, it wasn't on purpose. It wasn't a directive by Kimball. It just kind of happened that way, where they were just kind of boom, boom, boom down the line as they're coming from the Cedar Creek grade side, hitting that side of the hill and hitting that Confederate artillery from the front side, from the Pritchard Hill side. And it was just in perfect timing, in unison, that it couldn't have been planned any better. And that's what eventually pushed that artillery off the hill. And once it was off the hill and the artillery was done, it was like, we're done. And there was a point in the battle where Turner Ashby tells Stonewall that he thinks they're facing 10,000, and he said, "Don't speak of it. Don't talk."
I mean, it's close. It's 8,500 men that they're coming against, and the Confederates only have 3,800. And I mean, can you elaborate a little bit more on what's happening on the east side of the Valley Pike? I know we mentioned with Ashby initially starting, but some of those guys under, I think it's Sullivan.
You mean in the last phase?
Is that in the last phase? I'm just trying to make sure.
Yeah, those guys were held in reserve. Anybody east of the Pike, that main action in the early mornings of the 23rd.
That's where
that was all the early action.
Okay.
And that goes all the way back to Trex. You know where Trex is on that? Yeah. I mean, I've kind of driven that back there to see, and I've done it with the map key and everything. And more or less that Confederate push and line and battle that was happening there, engagement that was happening there, was all the way from Route 11 all the way to Trex forward.
Which is, it's like there's that road next to the bank where Savage's house was and distillery. Yeah. That road, I forget the name of it, but goes out. And
the Youth Development Center's right there on that road.
And basically that action takes place from the Valley Pike east all the way to where that road ends. And
Shawnee Drive, isn't it?
I think it's Shawnee Drive, yeah. And Hog Run goes down that and curves up with it as well. And okay, so that's the initial phase, and it shifts to the Pritchard's Hill, and then from there just shifts to Sandy Ridge and absolute chaos.
Yeah, and there's I always see on all the maps you'll see a house called the Mahaney House. And if you look on the map, it's below Kernstown on the left side of the pike, and it says Mahaney. And that was a brick house that was used by both sides, but it's always kind of my point of reference. And I did the key to see how far down that is, and there's a house that's always for sale down below a used car lot and the 7-Eleven. It's kind of like smack in the middle of those two. That's where the Mahaney house was, and that's kind of where they collected all the Confederate artillery at about noon or 1 o'clock. That's where they kind of decided what to do, and that's where they kind of left from. So it's kind of cool. I mean, if you go to the Kernstown battlefield, I mean, those guys are just incredible. They'll take you down to the flats, and I think you said, would it be cool to go up on Pritchard's Hill and get that vantage point? But it's even cooler to go down to Fulkerson's position and looking up at that position, you can see. It wasn't going to work. It could not work.
So let's talk about a little bit of our friends over at the Kernstown Battlefield Association. They operate. I don't know the total acreage count over there. It's a couple hundred acres of the Pritchard Grimm Farm, which is the site of Fulkerson's advance and has Pritchard's Hill on it, and significant for the Second Battle of Kernstown and the opening phases of the Second Battle of Winchester. And they fully run that off of volunteer support and donations. And they're open up until October 29th of this year, so on Saturdays and Sundays from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. So you can go there, and they've recently updated a lot of their interpretive signage.
And they just acquired the artillery positions up on Sandy Ridge.
Yeah, so ABT, the American Battlefield Trust, preserved, I think it's 20-something acres there on Sandy Ridge on the west side of Highway or Route 37, which is probably the southern line of
it's either McLaughlin's position or Waters' position, or a little of both.
McLaughlin's guys are that's Rockbridge, right? Artillery.
You asked me too fast.
I know. You can think about it.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So those Rockbridge guys are there. Rockbridge Artillery.
McLaughlin was Rockbridge, Waters was West Augusta, and Carpenter was Allegheny.
Okay. Yeah, but like you said, the best approach, the best way to view Pritchard's Hill, at least if you're trying to understand, what the heck was happening on that property on March 23rd, 1862, like you said, best perspectives from the Confederate perspective, I think, just to get, they've cut in now a trail that it's called the Fulkerson Trail, and you walk, or you can march or hike the approach of Fulkerson's guys, hugging the sides of the woods and then turning left, and that whole time you're walking it, you can see just Pritchard's Hill staring at you, and the interpretive signs that are up on that hill. And that's the best place to view it. And then, like you said, those guys are super great, and you catch them at a good time. And if they're feeling lovey, like they always are, they'll take you over to Sandy Ridge. They're figuring out how they can get it publicly accessible, but they'll take you up to that property they just acquired. There's some interpretive signs there now. They've cleared a ton. There's a view shed cleared from Sandy Ridge where you can see all the way across to Pritchard's Hill. So then you get that vantage point as well of how that Federal infantry attack came and what the artillery duel was looking like. And then right next to that property, but they're not connected yet, hopefully in the future, but they touch, is the Rose Hill Park, which you were mentioning, where the Stonewall is, where they've reconstructed a little bit of it. And that's owned by the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley, but maintained and operated by Frederick County as a park. So it's Rose Hill Park off Jones Road. And you can go there and hike, and they've gotten some interpretive signs there, but you can go to the Stonewall and, hike up the other side of Sandy Ridge comes on that property too. And you can get on top of that, and you won't get the same view you'll get from Kernstown Battlefields Association's part of Sandy Ridge, but you'll understand what it was like when the Confederates were funneling in, and then the attack from Tyler's guys. So there's a lot to see when you're touring Kernstown. And one thing we didn't mention, but I know you might have some things to add about this, Mike, is this is like, this is the first this isn't called the First Battle of Kernstown as it happens. This is called the Battle of Winchester until May of 1862 because this is the first big, large engagement to take place in this area, and is known in a lot of accounts as the Battle of Winchester. So this is not just the first taste of war and battle for a lot of these troops engaged, but for the citizens of this area. And I know, and this is a point I always make to people, is, you know, there was folks that were kids were coming out and watching the battle. And I don't know if you know a little bit more about those accounts of civilians from the town going out and watching the battle.
Yeah. I know that Cornelia Peake McDonald, I mean, she, if you think about as a crow flies, I mean, she's on Amherst Street. They could hear it. And that's another thing, too, is that Kimball was very good at hearing musketry and reading it. And there's accounts where he could hear how that musketry was being fired. Was it being fired in unison? How soon was the retort of the
return of fire?
Return of fire, or if it was sporadic firing, why? And he was very good and astute at hearing what was going on up there. But Stonewall said, you know, and people would say that, you know, who had been in battle, it was more musketry than they had heard at Manassas. And Stonewall would write about how the sound of musketry was so loud and continuous. So it makes you realize how they would run out of ammunition. You know, because they were running out of ammunition at the wall. Kimball was running out of ammunition on Pritchard's Hill. But for the civilians, I know that Kate Sperry came out to the battlefield and actually took a rock out of the rock wall and a bullet that she found on the ground, and took that with her after the battle.
Do we know where those are today?
I don't.
But that's crazy that she's like, you know, artifact collecting.
Yeah, it's
after the battle.
It's actually on the interpretive sign at Rose Hill.
Tells you how much I read when I'm there.
Yeah. When you get over by the glass house, it's on one of those. On one of those markers. But you know, Mrs. Lee, they would go up on Mr. Brown's roof.
Right next door.
Next door. They would go up on the roof and watch the battle. I know they could watch Third Battle very easily from up there. But another thing that's very interesting is that, you know, you've got Shields. Banks left at 3:00 that day. He went to Harper's Ferry. He's like, "You got everything good here?
Well,
Are you cool?"
Yeah, we didn't go into detail about it, but that's the whole point. Jackson got orders to not allow federal troops to help.
Yeah, Johnston told Jackson to press as much as he could without getting fully engaged. Banks was getting reports that it was nothing more than Ashby cavalry of not more than 700. So he was going to go back to D.C. and
then from there possibly towards Richmond, and that was against what Jackson should allow.
And Banks had already sent Sedgwick and Williams in support of McClellan. So he got rid of half of his men almost right away. So
Jackson's like, I got to act fast.
Yeah, but Jackson was kind of under the impression that there wasn't as many. There were, I think all said and done, I think they had Union had up to 8,000.
Yeah.
But Gary makes a very, very good point in his book, and from all military manuals and tactics, if an army is going to hit a fixed position, you need 3-1 to take that position. They didn't have 3-1 in Tyler's brigade. So if Stonewall would have had the ammunition, they may have held off long enough to at least leave the field with their tail between their legs, but salvaged. They lost a lot of men. When you look at the 750 that they consider missing casualties or killed, 250 of those were captured in the woods around Brookneal. But another thing that we didn't talk about is the signal stations that were set up between Kernstown and the Seaver House on Braddock, or on Boscawen. It was kind of the first time the Signal Corps was ever really used in battle, in a real battle. And they had about 3 to 4 signal stations running from Pritchard's Hill, probably Hollingsworth Mill, Bowers Hill, then to
the Seaver
House. And they were running flags. So the only way I knew about that was I saw somebody had a flag for sale, like a signal flag, which was given to one of the signalmen, and it said Winchester on it. but it had the Kernstown date. Then kind of goes back into what you were talking about. At that time, they were still calling it the Battle of Winchester. So that it's just kind of really interesting that they actually gave commendations for the first time in military history for Signal Corps at Kernstown.
Yeah, and the whole purpose of that is because Shields thinks he's in command still. He thinks he's commanding the battle from his bed in Winchester. And Kimball's like, "Whoa, I got this."
And he still thinks it's a very small Confederate force all the way up until 3 p.m. By the time that I think Banks is out the door at 3:15, and at that time Shields is still thinking that it's a very small thing.
Seems like both sides were just like massively misinformed about the other, and they're just kind of going at it until they can
absolutely
finally figure something out about the other.
And Shields told Kimball, I want you to pursue. And Kimball's like, I'm not doing that. He went up on Pritchard's Hill and plopped down on Pritchard's Hill, which was, the smart thing to do. I mean, it was the and it's kind of funny. Sandy Ridge is, I think they said 90 feet higher than Pritchard's Hill.
Yeah.
Which, if you look at it, you can't
tell.
You can't really tell.
It's so hard nowadays.
But that 90 feet elevation
made a huge difference.
It made it. Confederates were able to get those shells, pretty close.
Yeah, because you might be wondering, well, why leave Pritchard's Hill? But it's that exact reason. It's Sandy Ridge is the hill to have if you're going to have a hill.
And it would just and if they wouldn't have moved the infantry to take those artillery, each of their artillery positions, it just would have been an artillery duel, and they would have packed up and left at 6 o'clock, and we never really ever heard about it.
They just both decided to flank at the same time.
Yeah,
at the same time.
And then Jackson pulls. Well, Jackson doesn't pull out, but Garnett's guys pull out. And I guess the biggest takeaway from this battle, as it all obviously from what we've talked about, is it's technically a Union victory because Jackson leaves the field. But the most talked about thing with First Kernstown is how it's Jackson's first and only defeat. But in the grand scheme of things, and air quotes with this because everyone says it, Confederate defeat, Jackson defeat, but it's a tactical victory, they always say.
Yeah.
And that's because the bigger picture, and we talk about this in later episodes about the Valley Campaign and other battles in Richmond. It. But yeah, it's now eyes are on Jackson in the Valley because of what just happened at Kernstown and around Winchester. Banks' eyes are now focused in the Federal Army of the Potomac. It's like, oh crap, there's, Jackson's in the Valley. And this is the other historians, and we talk about this with Aaron Seaver in another episode, but it's, when does the Valley Campaign start? Some people say, with the Battle of McDowell on May 8th, 1862. Some people say it starts January 1st, 1862, because he's nonstop moving, and Bath Romney is basically just combined with this campaign. But majority of historians just go with First Kernstown as being the start of the Valley Campaign.
And you got to remember, Nathaniel Banks was third in command.
Yeah, he's the third highest ranking officer.
That's right, third highest ranking.
And he's just the former Speaker of the House, no military background.
That's right, and also it's an embarrassment.
Yeah,
I mean, for him being the third highest ranking, he leaves the field and leaves it to a subordinate. Now, I like James Shields. I like the guy. I mean, he's one of these rough Irish guys. People don't know that when he first came to America, he was shipwrecked, one of only 3 men to survive, and he gets shipwrecked on an island, and he ends up staying on that island for like 3 years. Wow. Then he gets back. Then he's coming to meet his brother here in the States. By the time he gets here, he finds out his brother's dead. So this guy, I mean, he just went through a lot of adversity. Now, and he was kind of a Mexican War badass. I mean, he was at Cerro Gordo. He was at Chapultepec. He was at, which is funny. He was at, I'm pronouncing that right, Chapultepec. He was there, and Jackson was there. Both artillery. I think they were both artillery guys. I think, but I'd have to double check that. Shields probably was infantry, but it's Shields doesn't get a lot of credit, but also it's all Kimball to me. And it goes back to what we were originally saying, that Jackson, just a bad day for him in terms of not really knowing what the objective was, didn't know the size that he was dealing with. But see, a lot of people say that it was it did what Johnston set out to do. It kept eyes on the valley, so they weren't sending men to aid McClellan. But the thing is, Banks had already sent Sedgwick and Williams to McClellan, so that had already happened. Sending more, maybe. The audacity and the bravado of Jackson was definitely got their attention, all the way up to Lincoln's attention. But I think it was all kind of a mistake, in a way. But he would, Jackson would redeem himself in those ways. The Garnett court-martial would only be stopped at Jackson's death. That ran all the way to Jackson's death.
Wow.
And then Garnett, of course, dies on the field at Gettysburg. And this is kind of a weird side story, is that when they collected the dead, I guess his jacket had been stripped off of him, and he was just, usually officers in higher ranking, especially generals, with that embroidery on your sleeve, they would have pulled you off to the side. They still respected.
They would have tended to you.
They would have attended to you. Try to get you back, probably home. They were doing things like that. They threw him in a mass grave with all the rest of the dead they found on the field. They found his sword in 1910 in a antique store in Baltimore, and it had his inscription, Richard Brooke Garnett, on the scabbard, and they think there was just a Union soldier field pickup.
Yeah, his body has never found, identified on the field.
Yeah,
so
he's in the. They were pretty good about those. Those battlefield graveyards being dug up and reinterred into a national battlefield cemetery, and that's what Winchester did the same thing in 1866. But you didn't get them all.
No.
And
they're still out there.
They're Kate Sperry, who came, and collected the rock and the bullet off the rock wall. She said it when she got up there. They were burying the Confederate dead up there, and she said there were about 50 of them, and they were burying them just hastily in a grave that's somewhere up on Sandy Ridge. They may have gotten to them. They may not have. You never know.
Yeah.
It's definitely hollowed ground. There's no way they got them all. It's so wooded up there too. It's so thick. And it was pretty wooded up there then. So if you were killed up there in those woods, they're still up there.
Yeah.
It's a beautiful place.
Beautiful,
preserved battlefield. Anybody who's never been there should go.
Oh yeah.
You'll learn so much, but the thing is, you'll be able to stand up on that hill and put yourself in that position and feel, that I call it tangible history, and that's why I do what I do. Is that I love touching, holding, finding history, telling the story about it, but it's the closest thing that you can get to being in that battle.
Yeah, I mean, this doesn't. Looking at a map and reading about it in a book is one thing, but you won't fully get the picture of what we're talking about, or what a book's talking about, or what a map's showing until you stand on it.
Yeah.
And
try to imagine the whistling and screaming of artillery shells coming at you. And I try to tell that to people around here all the time. It's like you go about your daily business and getting your Starbucks and going to your different things, and that's great and that's fine. But you got to know that men were trying to kill each other here.
Not that long ago either.
Not that long ago.
Yeah.
And it's just, you don't have to go in deep if you don't want to, but it's pretty damn interesting.
Yeah.
If you just just
recognize it and identify it.
And I have a lot of people who tell me that the most important thing I got out of doing the Winchester Tales books was that people who would come up to me and say, I've been working in that place for 10 years and had no idea that was a Civil War hospital.
Yeah.
Or something of that nature.
Yeah.
And that makes me happy, because it's just I've educated somebody to see the world in a little bit of a different way now.
Yeah.
That we're not, just because we're here presently doesn't mean that nothing really happened.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of makes people more a little self-aware, historically self-aware.
Well, and that's why I'm so thankful that you did what you did and you're doing what you're doing, because it's, it's work that tons of other people have, tried to do for different audiences, and you were able to bring it to life for the masses that, are just checking their Facebook feed. And it's like, whoa, my friend I went to high school with shared this, and it's like, never knew that. So thank you so much for coming on this episode and talking
Absolutely.
First Kernstown with us.
Well, thank you guys.
Sipping some rye whiskey.
It's got a good burn.
Yeah, no, it's we're excited, and stay tuned. We'll definitely have you on in the future to talk about many other Winchester things and Valley things. And thank you all for tuning in, and we look forward to doing another episode. So
We'll catch you on the next one.
Yep.